everyone. My name is Magda Tedder. I'm the Schwidler Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to today's celebration of a new book by our colleague Sarit Kattan Gribetz, who is an associate professor of classical Judaism at the theology department at Fordham. And I want to say that Sarit Kattan Gribetz is one of the most creative and erudite scholars I know. Her scholarship is deep yet accessible, and at times even playful, as is her article on language and mathematics in the book of Jubilee, which I really love. She has published on a variety of topics, such as time in antiquity, on gender, as we've heard her respond to Professor Moshe Rossman, including the use of women's bodies as metaphor for time, the correspondence between Philo and Seneca's philosophical approaches to quotidian time, and about recent temporal turn in the fields of ancient Judaism and Jewish studies. And at Fordham, she co-wrote an article with an undergraduate student on the Talmud in Korea. So you can see just the breadth of her knowledge and interest. She's currently working on a book, Jerusalem, A Feminist History. Sarit Kattan Gribetz is, as you noticed this year when she's been leading Jewish studies, is a generous and kind colleague from whom I certainly learn every day, an inspiring teacher and leader. And we are so delighted and honored to have her with us and grateful for her leadership this year. And as she's directed the center this year and devoted her energy to its success, today's event is hers. And we're honoring Sarit and celebrating her new book, Time and Difference in Rabbinic Judaism, which I hope you will read, and I'm sure you will enjoy. We will be joined today by Professor Elizabeth Shanks Alexander, who is Professor of Religious Studies at University of Virginia and author of Gender and Time-Bound Commandments in Judaism, which came out in 2013 and which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. She's also the author of Transmitting Mishnah, The Shaping Influence of Oral Tradition, and co-editor of Religious Studies and Rabbinics, among many, many articles. And I'll just give you a taste of them, of a couple of them. When one of them is When Cultural Assumptions About Text and Reading Reading and Logic Fail, Teaching Talmud as Liberal Arts. When the Dead Prim, Talmudic Gender as Theological Prompt, and Ritual on the Threshold, Mezuzah and the Crafting of Domestic and Civic Space. Her work more broadly explores how rabbinic literature functions as literature and how it conveys meaning. According to Professor Alexander, orality theory helps see rabbinic texts as moments in a large conversation, and her work often tries to reconstruct the thinking that drives the conversation. So I am really delighted to have her join a conversation today with Sarit Kattan Gribetz about her new book, Time and Difference, which I have right here, and I hope you'll enjoy the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to all of those who came to celebrate the publication of my book today and who are here to learn more about it. First, let me thank Magda not only for her exceedingly kind introduction and her support and friendship these past many years as I was working on this book, but also for serving for me as an example of a scholar, a teacher, and a leader who is incisive, inclusive, compassionate, creative, and who's always thinking about how to build and strengthen our community, both at Fordham and also in the larger field of Jewish studies. I'm continually inspired by Magda in her own work, and so it's a particular pleasure for me to be able to publicly acknowledge the big role that Magda has played for me in my own professional development since we became colleagues at Fordham. And I'm also really pleased to thank Elizabeth Shanks Alexander, who took me under her wing when I was still a graduate student, and who has been a conversation partner and an advocate ever since in Charlottesville, in Jerusalem, and now virtually from New York. And much of Liz's support happened behind the scenes, as I recently learned that she served as an anonymous reviewer of the book for the press. And so I'm grateful to be able to publicly thank her, not only for inspiring me with her scholarship, but also for devoting time to helping me with the publication process. There are many other people I wish to thank, and I do so in the acknowledgments of my book, though even there, I needed to hold back the extent of my thanks because I had so far exceeded my contract's word limit. The very first page of my book begins with a prologue about my parents and their relationship to time. And my acknowledgments at the end of the book conclude by thanking my husband, Jonathan, and our children, whose premature arrival prompted me to think in new ways about time precisely when I had none of it to spare. In between, I thank my teachers and students, and I draw on much inspiration from many scholars. The most gratifying part of publishing my book so far has been hearing from colleagues, students, friends, and family around the world who wrote not only to send congratulations, but also to update me about their lives. So thank you to all of you for being such a warm and a good community, of which I'm humbled and honored to be a part. And please know that I value each one of you, and those joining whom I've never met, I hope to meet you one day too. I submitted the final manuscript for publication last February in a world very different from the one in which we now find ourselves. That world, pre-pandemic, was one in which the constructedness of time was not obvious to almost anyone, but those few of us whose research focuses on the topic. The overarching argument of an undergraduate course I teach titled On Time and its Value is that time is culturally constructed, historically contingent, and disciplinarily specific. And my students and I, some of whom are joining us today, devote the majority of our semester to unpacking what these three phrases mean, how the very basic assumptions we make about time are neither natural nor universal, but rather products of the societies and communities in which we live, even when they seem natural or biological, because they're bound up with natural processes such as the rising and setting sun, the phases of the moon, the changing of the seasons, or the aging of our bodies. Units of time such as years, months, weeks, days, and hours, as well as our experience of these units and of time's passage more generally, are constructed. And moreover, I discuss with my students how the way in which we divide time and use time is not arbitrary. Quite to the contrary, it reveals our deepest societal and individual values, because how we choose to organize and how we choose to spend our time is really a reflection of what we value. In a typical semester, learning all this is a pretty big revelation for students. How many of us have contemplated, for example, the fact that the 7-day week was not the way that most people divided time in antiquity, or that dividing the day into standard hours is a relatively recent phenomenon. But in March, as soon as cities shut down, routines were uprooted, and we began counting in cycles of daily virus counts, weekly testing averages, and 2-week quarantines, we all became urgently aware of the constructedness of time. And I received dozens of notes from colleagues and friends remarking on how the time of a pandemic had fundamentally shifted their long-held notions of time. In its first pandemic issue, the New Yorker magazine's cover featured Eric Drucker's depiction of an empty Grand Central Terminal with its iconic clock in the center and a lone figure sweeping up. The image beautifully captured the sense of uncertainty and fear, especially in New York, where I live, as we all ventured into an unknown time. One of my favorite reflections on the topic was an article titled, "Here's How Time Works Now," published by Eli Grober in McSweeney's. It begins as follows. "Here at Time, we've made a few changes you may already be experiencing that we think you should know about. Please see below. A minute. A minute used to be 60 seconds long. We thought this could be spiced up. A minute can now be either an hour or it can take 3.5 seconds. We hope you enjoy this new feature. A day. You may remember that a day used to take place over the course of 24 hours. We felt this was too much. A day is now over the moment you first ask yourself, what time is it? It does not matter what time it actually is when you do this. As soon as you ask or think, what time is it? For the first time that day, even if it's 10 in the morning, it will suddenly be 8 at night." Grober's satirical article continues to describe what happened to weeks, weekends, months, and years. Early in the pandemic, time moved at lightning speed as rules and regulations were imposed at a rapid pace. Nowadays, it almost seems as though time has done a 180, reversing course as each day seems like the day before. Weeks and weekends blend together, and the future still feels like an infinite repetition of the slowness of now. And so here we are in December 2020, all in some way experts in time. I no longer need to persuade anyone that time is culturally constructed and historically contingent, nor that time matters for who we are and how we live, nor that to understand any society, past or present, we must examine that society's conceptions and organizations of time. And that brings me to my book, Time and Difference in Rabbinic Judaism, which examines conceptions and organizations of time in rabbinic sources composed between 200 and 600 CE in Palestine and Babylonia, but with lasting influence on subsequent Jewish communities all the way to the present day. As I explain in the book's introduction, and here I quote, "The overarching argument of my book is that the rabbis use timekeeping and discourses about time to construct social, political, and theological difference. I demonstrate that rabbinic texts articulate conceptions and structures of time that promoted and reinforced configurations of difference, and I highlight 4 examples: imperial difference that distinguished rabbinic time from Roman time, communal difference that separated Jewish time from Christian time, gender difference that divided men's time from women's time, and theological difference that contrasted the time of those who dwelled on earth from the time of those in the heavenly sphere, including God and the angels." I contend that the processes through which various forms of difference are constructed in rabbinic texts, be they, for example, differences between men and women or between Jews and Christians, cannot be fully understood without also considering the constructions, discourses, and practices of time that undergird them. And that's because time, its conception and its organization, serves as a powerful mechanism through which to enact difference and forge identity. So put very simply, my book argues that time is used both to create community, as when a group of people follow the same calendar or celebrate the same set of holidays, and also to construct difference, as when a group uses a different calendar or deliberately abstains from participating in the festivals that those around them observe. Let me conclude my opening remarks with a brief set of texts, also from the introduction of my book, that illustrates what I mean by timekeeping being used as a mechanism through which to forge difference. Rabbinic texts recognize that distinctions in time reckoning differentiate Jews from others. The Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, for example, an early rabbinic midrash, states that a solar eclipse is a bad omen for Gentiles, and a lunar eclipse is a bad omen for Israel because Gentiles reckon by the sun and Israel reckons by the moon. The midrash adds a theological dimension to its description of Israel's calendrical system. By observing the moon every month, the Israelites regularly, in the words of the Midrash, lift up their eyes to their Father in heaven. The lunar calendar is thus presented as a mechanism for differentiation, not only because it is distinct from the solar calendar, but also because its rituals connect Israel more directly to God. Moreover, the Mechilta distinguishes between competing chronological systems, a different way of keeping time, meaning keeping years. The Midrash notes that biblical sources usually, quote, count according to their own era, when they date events in reference to the Exodus or the temple's construction or destruction, but that they also occasionally, quote, count according to the era of others, when they date events relative to the start of foreign rulers. The Midrash dramatically argues that relying on the times and histories of others rather than on their own era diverts Israel's devotion away from God and eventually leads them to subjugation and oppression under the very authorities upon whose times they rely. These rabbinic passages, and there are many others across the rabbinic corpus, depict coexistence and tension, the coexistence and tension of multiple times and time frames. They even explicitly acknowledge that different groups of people divide time differently, and that doing so differentiates them one from the other. So regarding the organization of time as a mechanism for the construction of difference, for the construction of identity and subjectivity and difference, suggests that time in these rabbinic sources was not only or even necessarily a dimension through which individuals and communities pass, but also, or even more prominently, a dynamic force, a powerful, if intangible tool that was harnessed and even manipulated to affect certain results. So I'll stop there and I'll turn the floor over to Liz to offer her own reflections.
So first of all, thank you so much, Sarit and Magda, for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be here to celebrate. And so first of all, you know, if I am, quote, responding to this book, I just have to tell you, it's a great book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. If you have read parts of it, I recommend reading the whole thing. It is simply a pleasure to read. It's beautiful. Sarit is an excellent, beautiful writer, just elegant. It's so easy to follow. And then in addition to being very easy to follow, it is just plain old interesting and thought-provoking. As an endorsement, you'll be happy to know that I have already used it in my teaching this semester. And in fact, I have a graduate student who's working on a paper. We're going to meet again tomorrow. And he is going to be working with Sarit's help, unbeknownst to Sarit, on a passage that I learned yesterday when talking to Sarit is possibly her favorite passage in the book. So you'll be happy to know, Sarit, that already your book is making a difference in the minds and thinking of the up and coming. So that's, thank you. And I want to share, so starting my formal remarks, I want to start just by, because many of you I'm sure will not have read the book. So I just want to start by reiterating the basic argument of the book, and also just for the record saying I find it very convincing. And that is that time is culturally constructed. It's unique and distinct cultural settings. It is historically contingent, that is, it is conditioned by historical events. And therefore, because of these contingencies, time functions as a medium through which various social entities, be they communities, be they individuals, be they political entities, through which various social entities express identity and construct social difference. So that's the basic thesis. And then Sarit goes on to explore this in 4 different chapters, each of which addresses distinct units of time and distinct social entities whose identity is being constructed. So the first chapter is about the annual calendar of the Roman Empire in the instituted in the 1st century CE, and the holidays and the way in which rabbinic Jews or rabbis created a discourse about those holidays, which gave them an experience of being Jewish subjects within a Roman imperial context. So that's the first of the 4 chapters. The second chapter is about the unit of the 7-day week and the Sabbath, which functions as a culmination of that week or an organizing feature of that week. And that chapter explores how that unit of time is experienced as a way to pivot difference on the communal level between Jews and Christians primarily. The next chapter goes to the unit of the day. So rituals that mark the beginning of a day and the end of a day, or if you're starting with Mishnah Brachot, the end of a day and the beginning of a day. And the way in which those rituals are shaped by gender, or gender plays a role in the formation of those rituals. And then the final chapter is on the way in which units, is about the smallest unit of time, the unit which is the hour. And, but it's also about the hugest difference, the way in which God spends God's hours and humans spend their time, and the ways in which those intersect and interact, and therefore it becomes a medium for thinking about what is the difference, what does it mean to be human versus what does it mean to be divine. So that's the basic structure. In my remarks, what I want to do is I want to foreground the mechanisms by which time is being deployed and by which difference is being produced. So again, how time is being deployed on one hand and how difference is being produced. So I want to start by talking about how time is deployed. Specifically, one thing that I noted when I was reading is that there are different ways of referencing time, and time is not engaged in a universal way. So just as, you know, the basic thesis has to do with the cultural construction of time or the historical contingency of time, even time itself is not a thing which is sort of just there, but rather time is encountered in various different ways. So for example, Sarit just talked in her opening remarks about how time can be reckoned. That is, I can sit and reflect on how I want to organize my time. And then there are discussions about how I'm going to spend my time. And then there are various discussions about rituals and ways to mark time. So in thinking about this notion of how do we intersect with time, or interact with time, how is time deployed, I want to think about these two, especially these rubrics that I found run throughout the book, which is how do we spend time versus how do we mark time. So that's what I want to think about in terms of how time is deployed. And then I want to think about how time can be used to produce difference. So I saw a variety of different arrangements. So on one hand, time can be synchronized, but it can be invested with different meanings. And so we're going to see an example of this in the chapter on Roman time, the way in which Rabbinic Jews talk about the imperial calendar of holidays. And so on one hand, there is attention to the Roman calendar. So there's a certain kind of synchronization. You can't be a Rabbinic Jew without being aware of the Roman calendar. On the other hand, the rabbis are investing these festivals with radically different meanings than the Romans invest them with. So that's a technique that I would call, that is a way to produce difference through synchronization, things that are happening at the same time, but have very different meanings. There's another technique that I call anti-synchronization. That is where things that used to happen at the same time are made to now happen at different times in a very deliberate way in order to produce difference. And an example of this would be the Christian moving the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. So that is a kind of anti-synchronization. And then there's another way that difference and identity are produced. And that is, I think as a mother who at one point had 2-year-olds, and there was this concept of parallel play. I think when you have 2-year-olds, they don't do, you can do a play date, but they don't actually know how to play with each other, but they each play in these parallel universes next to each other in the same room. So I think about this idea of parallel universes. People can be doing different things, but they're doing them at the same time. And the example that is the strongest example of this for me in the book is the rituals that males and females use or are instructed to use, irrespective. We don't know the historical reality of social actors behind these texts, but the instructions. So males and females are instructed to engage in distinct rituals at the same time. So you have men who are looking to various cosmological phenomena, the sun, the moon, the stars. Is it time to say the Shema or not? And you have women who are at the same time engaging both in the morning and in the evening, engaging in a ritual observation of their own bodies that are orient them towards the family. They're looking at they're checking for impurity, and and maybe the idea is that they should be in a state of readiness for purity readiness for relationships with their husbands. So that would be parallel universes. So I find it interesting to not only recognize the cultural construction and the historical contingency of time, but also the very diverse kinds of mechanisms. And so I want to conclude by sharing 2 of my favorite moments in the book, just because I think they help us see the range of ways in which Sarit allows us to see time being used to construct difference. So first of all, the first chapter, which talks about the Roman calendar reforms in the 1st century CE. And if I got that wrong, Sarit, I invite you to correct me because you're the expert. I'm just speaking off the top of my head there. So there's a set of historical events, and then there is a rabbinic response. And so we see that response in terms of Mishnah Avodah Zarah. Here are a list of various Roman holidays. We don't celebrate them. We abstain from various kinds of activities with Gentiles. And so what Sarit very illuminatingly points out is that, in fact, by making this list and making all of these restrictions, in fact, the rabbis exhibit a very finely attuned sensibility to the Roman calendar. So at the very moment that the Roman calendar is a device for Roman imperial hegemony, you see a rabbinic response. And then furthermore, so it's not just that they're attuned to that calendar, but what Sarit talks about is in the Talmuds, the Talmudic reception of these laws, there is a rabbinic etiology of these various Roman festivals, so that even the Roman festivals, which are about the founding of Rome, in fact are responses to a biblical history. So this is a word, so the word that I wrote down here is, there is an Israelitification of the Roman calendar. So using the rubrics that I started with, what I want to note then is that, first of all, we're talking about articulating difference by, first of all, marking time. We're not talking about how time is spent here. We're talking about marking time at these various distinct moments. And we're also dealing here with synchronization. In other words, the rabbis are experiencing the calendar of the Romans at the same time, but they are investing that Roman calendar with a whole set of different meanings. There's a hidden transcript. So that's the first example. And the second example is one of my absolute favorites, which is about how God spends God's time. And there's various, there's like hours in the day, and God spends a third of God's time in judgment, and a quarter of God's time in judgment, and a quarter of God's time in Torah study. And then, of course, God also has to have some playtime. So God has a play date with the Leviathan in one version. And so I think here that time is functioning as a medium for the rabbinic theological imagination. It's thinking about who is God, what is God, how do we fathom God, and doing it in this very concrete, very material modality. And it's in fact quite counterintuitive. It puts God into very material and constrained environment, as opposed to, I think, the Philo version is God is outside of time, God is eternal. And this is submitting God to the very categories of human existence and trying to work that out. So here we have the idea, again, not so much about how time is marked, but rather using time for thinking about the way in which time is spent. How does God spend God's hours? And again, here, I think that though there is an element of synchronization, there's various instructions that humans, Israelites, rabbis should use their time in various ways that correspond to how God is using God's time. But it also becomes, I think, a real stimulant for the imagination. How do we think about that, the ways in which God is different? And ironically, what makes God unique is not God's being outside of time, but God's enormous, enormous precision with time. God can handle the wink of an eye. God is aware of that, something that no human, except apparently Balaam, was capable of. And so anyway, so I'm going to stop there. I think I've probably gone on a little bit longer than I might have. And I'm going to invite Sarit to come back on the page. Come back on the screen. So I just want to invite you. So first of all, I've offered some rubrics for thinking about this, for weaving together the different chapters, or maybe even for extending your thesis, in terms of not only, historically contingent, culturally contingent, but even the dynamics are really diverse.
First of all, thank you so much for all the reflections. Maybe I'll begin by tying all of the chapters together in yet another way, which is that the chapters are organized according to time. So the first chapter, which is about Roman rabbinic time, is centered unit of the year and specifically on annual festivals. And then the second chapter on Jewish time is focused on the unit of the week. And then the gendered time chapter is on the unit of the day, and especially those transition moments of the day. And then the chapter on and humans is on the hour, sort of subdivisions of the day. And so in a way, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that there are all these, not only are there distinctions between how we organize, how we mark time and how we spend time, but also that there are many different units of time and all work together. So what I don't claim is that there's only rabbinic Roman difference on an annual cycle, only Jewish Christian difference on a weekly cycle, but that all of these differences operating sort of in the largest units of time. The year is the largest that but of course we have the time of the universe and the creation and the eschaton as well, even in the most the most precise times, which in antiquity were the unit of the hour. But then also that at the heart of all of this is the unit of the day. And so it's about special days of the year, special days of the week. It's about the beginning of the day, and then it's about how the day comes together as a set of hours. And both special days, so days that are unique in some way, full Sabbaths, and then on the other hand, days that are routine and everyday days, quotidian time, and that all of those units of time, ways of conceptualizing time, marking time are all really interrelated. Like we can't organize time without having a conception of time, but we also conceive of time without organizing it. And that's actually an insight that I learned many years ago in my theories and methods class in the study of religion. Emil Durkheim writes, like, we can't even conceive of time without dividing time. And so the other argument is that the way that people organize time is something as simple as a daily schedule, a calendar, tells a lot about how they conceive of time in these other ways. So that's the first sort of reaction that I have. The second is that there's one whole constellation of differences that I didn't devote it to, but I do discuss in a subsection of one of the gender, which is about the way in which time is not only gendered, but also is dependent on class and status, and that one of the topics is this idea, right, that time, one's schedule, one's access to free time, one's control over time matter in rabbinic sources of gender, for example. So certain groups of people have over their time and others don't. And also of class and status. So when, for example, of enslaved people. And one of the ways I think we can understand what a system of slavery is a control over time, and rabbinic passages also thematize that idea, and so let's throw that into the mix too. One of the places they do this is right at the end of the discussion of the Shema. There's an extended debate in the Babylonian Talmud about whether the time of the priests who come home to eat their in the evenings is the same time as the time of the poor people come home and eat their bread with salt in the evenings. Like, do the priests and the poor people eat at the same time, and therefore are those times the same? Or do they eat at different times, and or there's actually a contradiction about when the Shema ought to be said? And then they have a third time, which is the time of the people who come on the Sabbath and eat their dinner in the evening after it's dark. And so what the discussion is all about is we have the time of the priests, and then we also have this day of the week, the Sabbath, which is the people's time, meaning that there aren't these distinctions between poor and priest. And the question is, are they the same or are they different? And the Babylonian Talmud concludes that these times must have been different. And so they acknowledge the social and economic dimension of difference that underlies the distinctions, right? Poor people come home earlier to eat so that they don't have to light candles or burn oil, whereas the wealthy doesn't. I mean, we see that as well in the Mishnah when the Mishnah talks about how late in the day can someone say the Shema, and the latest one can is the time when kings get up, and this idea of kings waking up early. And then I'll share one more rabbinic text, which is also Babylonian Talmud, but it's about Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, who meets a government official who's tasked to arrest thieves. And the rabbi asks the official a question, which is like, how do you distinguish between a thief and an innocent person? Like a basic question of criminal justice that we're still grappling with. And the official says, well, thieves prefer the nighttime, right? So those who are out and about at night are to be thieves. And the rabbi's not happy with this answer, and he's worried that someone who is innocent will be captured. And so he criminal justice reform advice to the official, and he says, "Let me give you a different strategy. Go into a tavern at the 4, right? So at some point in the later morning, and if you someone dozing off with a cup in their hand, ask them why they're so tired. And if it's a scholar, then the person says, well, I woke up early to study, and that's why I'm already tired at the 4th hour. And if it's someone who's a day laborer, they're going to say that they woke up early to their work. And if it's a night laborer, they're going to tell you that they were up late working. And if they have an excuse for being tired at the 4th hour, then you'll know that they've been out doing illegal things. And so what I really like is that the whole story, like the whole encounter, is premised on this idea that servers, day laborers, night shift workers experience the same hour, 4 o'clock, in different ways. And it plays around with that. And maybe I'll conclude my response by sharing a story about my own experience of writing the book, which is that in the month when I was finishing the book, I spent several late nights in my office. And on one particular night, I lost steam at 3 a.m. or so, and I decided to rest in my office until dawn, and then I would go home at dawn. And I vividly remember leaving my office at 5:36 a.m. and walking across this. And I had assumed, foolishly in retrospect, that no one was up at such an early hour, especially not on a college campus, and that my walk would be a solitary one, as it usually is, late at night on campus. But I was entirely wrong, because at 5:36 in the morning, the campus bustling with people, because that's when those who come to work in the dining halls, to prepare breakfast and have other roles that they play on campus, arrive on set that hour. And so it was a humbling experience for me, and also a really fitting and moving, given the subject that I had been up all night writing about, to be reminded that not everyone has the same schedule, and actually not everyone has the luxury of particular types of schedules. And so that brings me back to this idea of that can be recited as late as the 3rd hour, because that's when kings rise. And this idea of like the temporal parameters of rabbinic rituals, sort of accommodating many different kinds of people, and then also excluding people, early risers, also the wealthy, and the elite members of society, and sort of grappling with the acknowledgement that people experience time differently, have more or less of it to spend, and how do you sort of create a system around that? So maybe I'll stop there so that we can also take questions from the audience.
Thank you both so much. We have a couple of questions, and one actually ties to the question of dawn and sun setting and morning. And so the question is asking the question is actually for you to comment on the vexed question of when the sun rises and when the sun rises into prayer.
So a question. Well, one of the interesting things about rabbinic kind of time, first, is that the day begins in the evening, but it's not so clear when evening begins. And actually, the day begins in a time of uncertainty and liminality, in a time called Ben Hashmashot. So every day has twilight, and we get this idea of the twilight zone, right, from the idea that there's a period of time in the day when it's not clear whether it's the previous day or the next. And so there's this time, like a time of uncertainty, works really well, I think, for thinking about difference. Like there's a time of day might be one of 2 days, and we're not sure what it is. And this impacts both the way that rabbis think about their world in terms of the stories about the world. So, for example, it is Ben Hashmashot in this time period between days, and specifically between the 6th day and the 7th day, the Sabbath, that these magical things are created by God in the first week of creation. So it's in that time period when things like the Leviathan are created, in a period where people need to rest, but God still can create. And then also it impacts the way that halakha develops, because for rituals where you need to wait a certain number of days, you have to make sure that you're counting the right day. And so there are big questions that get asked. If something happened hashmashot in this period in the evenings, what day it is, when can we assume it's the previous day? When can we assume it's the day?
So another question is about the, not related to rabbinics, but to writing about time, about Alan Littman's Einstein dreams, and to what extent it has informed your own musings on time. Someone is a fan of the novel, as I am, and I thank you for introducing it to me.
So Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams is one of my favorite books, and I should publicly acknowledge that my dear friend and partner in crime, Lynn Kay, who also works on rabbinic time, introduced me to this book. And it's a book in which the author imagines Einstein during the period when he was writing his theory of relativity, right? So just to set the scene, Einstein is living at a time when time was being rethought in general, right? It's a time when there were debates about standardized time, and not only scientifically, but also socially. And what happens in the course of the book is that Einstein has a series of dreams. I can't remember how many, something around 30. And in each one, he completely reimagines the world. So one of my favorite is he describes, so in his dream, Einstein sees a very old woman in a chair, and she can't hear, and she can't see, and she could barely move. And with time, she slowly regains her vision, and she regains her hearing, and then she regains her physical mobility, and she's able to stand up, and soon enough she's able to run, and her hair turns from white to gray to black, and then all of a sudden, before you know it, she's crawling, and she's crying, and she's nursing. And this idea that you go in reverse of what you're used to in time. And he then has a vision of a piece of fruit that's in the trash. And you wait for the moment when you can take the fruit out of the trash, and it gets hard enough to be able to eat it. Right? So this idea of, instead of a fruit going from being ripe to rotting, going from rotting to being ripe. And each one of these dreams completely shatters your assumption about how time works. And at least when I read the book, I think, yeah, why do we age from babies to old people rather than from the elderly to the infant? Like, it's not obvious why that would be. And some of them are completely unrealistic, like this one. But there are others, for example, that time moves more quickly the lower you are, and more slowly the higher you are. And so the best piece of real estate is on the highest mountain you can find, and everyone just like stays as high as possible and never comes down. And that seems in a way absurd, but first of all, actually scientifically, there is a difference between altitude and how quickly time moves in reverse to what Einstein dreams in his dream, actually. But also we can think of the extent to which people go to try to save time for themselves. And so the book really highlights, I think, for me, just how even the basic assumptions we make about time, when you step back, are really weird. And in a way, that's true also of rabbinic sources. So at least for people who are familiar with rabbinic sources, stepping back from them and sort of appreciating their quirkiness and weirdness helps us see things that I think we take for granted. For example, the fact that God has a schedule that God abides by every day.
Yeah.
I just wanted to listening to you talk about the novel, and I want to get the name down, and I'll read it. But makes me wonder. So you are now an expert on rabbinic time. Has this translated into your life? Do you do time better? I mean, all of us want more time, struggle to make our time efficient. Are there things that you have learned that somehow enable you to live, I don't know, more effectively in a world where there is time?
So it's a great question. And I will say that when I teach my undergraduate students, I begin the semester by the following three questions. What is time? What is a good use of time, and what is a bad use of time? Which is a question of values. And how do we spend our time in accordance to our values? And that is a lot easier said than done. But on a good day, when I am not frantic about all of the things that I need to do, I have found it really helpful to ask myself that question, which is, what do I value? And those things change on a daily basis. It's not that there are the same values always dominate, but what do I value? What's important? And how can I make sure that I spend my time in accordance with my values? So that's something that I have learned in thinking about time historically, is that time and value are so related. And we see this actually in a rabbinic text in a late midrash that plays with this idea of God's time. It says that God divides time into thirds during the day. God spends time studying Torah, God spends time judging the world, and God spends time nurturing and feeding the creatures. And then God spends only 1 hour playing in tzchok, in laughter. And it says when people come to the end of their life and they encounter God, God will say, I didn't waste my time. I barely gave myself the sort of leisure time. How did you spend your time? Did you waste your time on tzchok, or did you use your time in good ways? And so it's actually a lesson. It's embedded in a homily, and it's trying to teach people to say, be deliberate about how you use your time, that everyone can make different decisions about how they use their time. But I think being deliberate about it helps us make those decisions well.
So I'm very aware of time. So I'm going to ask the three questions. There are many more, but I think these are tying nicely. The first one is about God and time, and the question is whether how do this discussion of God and time, how God spends time, what impact do these understandings have on God and time and contemporary rabbinic negotiation of time in larger society in which they find themselves. And then two others relate back to the texts. And one is about the issue of sanity and mental illness in relation to ability to recognize time, especially the difference of day or night. And the questioner, Daniel Sawyer from Fordham, is thinking about the blessing to distinguish between day and night, and the discussion in Chagiga about whether being in a graveside at night necessarily indicates insanity. And then the closing question is about effacement of difference. So the question is whether the rabbis looked at the notion of eternity as a place for the effacement of difference.
Thank you. So maybe I'll start with the question of the distinction between day and night, and emotional well-being and mental illness. So one of the arguments that I make in the introduction of my book is um, it started as a question, like, what's interesting about studying time in rabbinic sources in particular? And the argument is that moments of social, political, cultural, historical crisis and transformation are opportunities to think through and reorganize a society's time. So we see that, for example, in the French Revolution, with when a new calendar was introduced and a new chronological system was introduced. And we see it also in the Roman period, right, where a new calendar was introduced at a moment of particular political instability and transformation from republic to empire and so on. I think something similar happens in the first century with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and general sort of reconfiguration of Jewish sovereignty and Jewish relationship to the Roman Empire. So we're in an empire that is so committed to time, right? We still use that empire's calendar today. And here the rabbis are grappling with not having their central institution. And I argue that the destruction of the temple usually is thought of as a spatial trauma, right? That there's no center of pilgrimage, there's no unifying cult site, but that also it's a temporal trauma, that so much of sort of the conceptual architecture of time was centered around the rituals and the customs and even the annual cycle surrounding the temple. And so not having that sort of gave rabbis like the opportunity or the push to rethink what time was. And my favorite source circles back to this question of the psychological trauma of moments, which is a text called Fourth Ezra from the late first century, which is a text in which the scribe Ezra is mourning the destruction of the temple, and the text begins with Ezra having insomnia. Ezra can't sleep. It's late at night, and he can't sleep because all he can think of is the destruction of the temple, and he sees the destruction playing over and over again in his mind. And so that prompts him to have a series of visions in which he asks the angel, what's happening in the eschatological future? When is the end of time as we know it coming? And I say in the book that it's exactly at the time when the author of Fourth Ezra is in a new time and grappling with the times, that his own schedule is disordered, right? He can't sleep at night because he's awake from the trauma, and that sort of prompts these like really big questions about knowing when things will happen in the future, which is of course unknowable. And that maybe answers a little bit the last question, which is about the eschatological time. So I'll answer that in two ways. The first is this idea that there are certain things that we can't know, and in rabbinic sources, much of the discussion about creation and eschatology teeters on this line of how much can humans know about the cosmos, and how much is just an epistemological impossibility. And so you can study creation, but you can only do it under certain circumstances, and you can only know so much. And the same is true about the eschatological future. You can't know so much. So in a way, even the knowledge of a future distinguishes between the human and the divine, right? What makes God divine is knowing about the future that humans can't. On the other hand, some rabbinic sources, including the source about God's schedule, imagine an eschatological era in which actually there are differences between people still, and the text that I have in mind about God's schedule is embedded in a longer homily in Tractate Avodah Zarah, which is specifically about idolatrous worship and the relations between Jews and those all around them in their world. And it's a story about the all of the nations of the world coming to God in the eschatological era, trying to appease God at the end of times. And God gives them a commandment, which is to sit in a sukkah, right? So what does God say? God says, sit in a sukkah on a holiday. And they can't do it. And that sort of prompts this whole discussion about Jewish-Gentile difference. And so I think the rabbis have a more complicated view about difference being elided at the end of time than we might wish that they did.
All right. So I think it's time to wrap it up. Do you want to have any final say before we close?
Well, I'll say thank you to everyone for joining us, and also for conversations that have made their way into the book, and also that are a result of the book. And thank you to both of you for having that conversation with me today.
And I would like to welcome you again for our upcoming events. Our next event, and I hope pasting an RSVP link, is on Thursday in the chat box. You should all get it. And this is a conversation with Nancy Sinkoff about her recent book on Lucy Davidovich, and the focus will be the book, but also we'll discuss the questions of her views on Polish-Jewish relations. And we have one more event next week. That's our joint event with Columbia University and the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies there. We have a joint postdoctoral fellowship, the Rabin Shvidler postdoctoral fellowship, and our fellow this year is Alon Tam, and he will be speaking about Egyptian Jewish community and history and nostalgia about that. So I hope you'll join us. We will be sending you a reminder on Monday, and thank you again. Enjoy the evening, and we'll see you again. Thank you so much.